Hey guys, it's me Ben, and welcome to a new video where today I'm going to be showing kind of the full process of how I make my custom Lego painted minifigures. This video was requested by Eric the Skeleton. He said something about this the other day, and I realized, hey, that's actually a really good video idea, and it's something I probably should have done a long time ago. So basically, I'm just going to be working through the whole process, everything I do from start to finish making custom minifigures. So I think first thing I should say is that I always split up my customizing into like 3 sections of work. I'm going to be referring to them as sculpting, prep work, and painting. Overall, usually a custom takes about 4 hours, sometimes 3, sometimes more. And 2 days of work total, even though usually I spread it out over more days. But yeah, I would say like give yourself some time on this. I used to really rush my customs. Now I spend a lot more time on them, like multiple days work. And if you give yourself some time, take it slow, you can get a product that you really like. Before we get into it, I do want to say that I have a process that I think is pretty different from most customizers, and that I do everything very linear. I try to sit down and finish a figure. I know a lot of customizers who will, say sculpt and paint different parts in the same day and have like 10 or 3 to 10 different figures going at the same time. I usually try to sit down and make one figure at a time, and I find that's just more helpful, and it helps me to get the figures done. It just helps me to like figure out my plan and what I'm doing. But if you want to, have multiple figures going, be painting one, sculpting one, prepping one, do that, or working on different pieces at different times. I like to sit down and do it all, but hey, I mean, a lot of this video you can kind of do the way that you want to do it, or the way that fits you best. Before we get into any of the 3 processes of work, I guess, you're going to need minifigure parts, of course, so I always start off by just making kind of a base minifigure. I usually try to somewhat match like the colors that I want to use for the figure, and it really depends, on if you're going to paint everything, because there's some like pieces I don't like to paint, like usually faces. I want to have an actual skin tone for the face, and usually like sometimes I'll even use an existing printing piece for a face or a torso or something. So, but yeah, you just want to get together all the pieces that you want in your custom. So the first section that I do is sculpting. So for sculpting, I use green stuff. I've found that it's just what works best for me. I know a lot of people use Procreate. So yeah, just have some clay on hand, because there's a lot of times where Lego doesn't have a piece that fits exactly what you need, and you'll need to sculpt it. So today I'm making Spider-Punk from Across the Spider-Verse, and I wanted to give him a sculpted head because his head is bigger in the movie, and I wanted to have something to attach his spikes into. So yeah, I always start with sculpting first because it takes the longest. So for green stuff, you mix up the blue and the yellow together. And then you put it on the figure and kind of just mess with the design. I found a tip that I always use is if you wet your fingers after you've placed the green stuff where you want it to, or wet, your tool or whatever you want to use, it's a lot easier to kind of mold the clay into whatever you want to make. People have asked me before if you can use like bake clay, like oven baked clay or air dry clay, and from my experience, I would not do that. I've used like oven baked clay before, and it's actually it might have just been the kind I used, but I've used some that's actually like poisoned my Lego pieces. Like I've put oven clay in a piece, and the piece just like broke from the inside out. It's kind of weird, so wouldn't really recommend that. But green stuff or Procreate are great. I got my green stuff on Amazon. But yeah, I just put it where I wanted to be, sculpt it with my fingers. And yeah, it's pretty simple. I also use the sculpting stage to add anything to the figure that's going to have to connect to the green stuff. For example, in this figure, I'm putting spikes into his head, and it was just a lot easier to stick those into the clay than using glue. Green stuff holds stuff pretty well. So, yeah, I mean, use the sculpting stage sometimes for other elements if you have to kind of stick them together, which is what I did right here. Sculpting usually takes the least amount of time to actually do it, like putting the clay on, sculpting it. Usually doesn't take more than 30 minutes, but I always like to give my clay time to dry, so green stuff is just air dry clay. There are ways to speed it up, but I find it's best to just finish sculpting and leave the figure overnight and wait until the next day to work on it again. I don't think you have to wait a full day, but that's just what I always do. And so my figures always take 2 days at least, because I sculpt the first day, let it dry, and do the prep work the next day. So yeah, prepping is next. And I mean, technically sculpting is also prep work, but I just had to separate them because there's so much time in between the two usually. But you know, a lot of this stuff I can do at the same time. So for prep work, that's going to be sanding the figures is the main thing that you do for prep work. So basically, I made a separate tutorial on this that I think is a little more in depth, and I'll probably make another tutorial soon, since that one was a long time ago. But basically, I like to sand the inside of my minifigures' arms as well as the tops of their legs, and it just really helps to prevent the paint from scraping off of the minifigures. So I always do that as a part of my prep work. And then other than that, the prepping just really depends on the figures. Sometimes all they need is the sanding. Sometimes they don't need any sandings. But prep work is going to be like erasing prints off minifigures. I've made a tutorial on that if you want to see how to take the prints off minifigures. A lot of times it's going to be making 3D accessories that aren't sculpted. So some people sculpt everything, but I like to use other things as well. So I use a paper jacket here, which I also have a tutorial on, a more recent tutorial that's a pretty good tutorial. So I'll link all of these in the description. But I made a paper jacket, and then I put E-tape on it. I found that other than green stuff, parts that, well, green stuff and Lego. I use Lego the most of my customs. Then after that, I use green stuff. And then after that, I usually use paper and E-tape, electrical tape, which is pretty cheap. You can find it just about anywhere. And I really like it because it has the same kind of glossy look as Lego. And it worked really great for this figure because it needed a leather jacket. And so the black E-tape just looked like leather. So that worked out pretty well. Just a reminder, again, these 3 sections aren't always like super linear. It's not always going to be you sculpt and then you prep and then you paint. Sometimes it happens to me, but sometimes you're going to have to be going back and forth. I had to do some prepping while I was sculpting. I had to do some prepping while I'm painting because there's some parts that have to attach to painted parts, or some parts have to attach to sculpted parts. So yeah, you can work on these one at a time, but a lot of times you're going to have to do a lot of crossing over. But for the most part, you can do them in a row like how I do here. Now it's time for our final block, which is painting. I waited a day after prepping for painting, but usually you can do the 2 in the same day. I just use folk art, matte paint, not really for any particular reason. It's just what I use to this day. I don't know why I started using it, but I find it works really well. But I think pretty much any paint works. I've heard like lots of different kinds, and some people want their figures to be glossy. I usually use matte, and if I want to make them glossy, I just spray them with some sealant afterwards. But I'm just using matte paint here. So in painting, I usually try to just start off by painting in really solid colors. So, you know, paint the head the color that the head's going to be, and paint the torso the color that the torso is going to be. You can do all of this painting with a paintbrush, and it's easier to just get it done with first. You can also use paintbrush for, you know, if you want to have like boots on a character, I would recommend using a brush for that. Pretty much anything that's going to be like large sections of paint, you just want to use a brush for, and usually you want to get it done first. I will say there are some colors that are more difficult to paint. Red, for example, it's very hard to paint with red just because it takes a lot of layers to cover something up with red. I usually end up doing about 5 layers for red, and there's some colors that only take a few layers, so If I'm painting with black, that usually takes like 2 layers of paint. But yeah, you're going to want to do multiple layers of paint no matter what. After all the parts are painted, it's time for my favorite part, which is the detail work. So I've heard different customizers use different ways to do detail work. But what works best for me and what I'd recommend is just using toothpicks. They have really fine tips, so it's easy to paint with them. There's some issues because they don't hold paint super well, but I've found it's easier than most things. I know some people that like use just really thin paint brushes or glue their paint brushes. Or a friend of mine even used a cactus, like the prick of a cactus. But yeah, you want to just use something really small to paint these. And again, if you're using a cactus prick or for this technique, I mean, I know some of you were kind of younger, so you might want to ask a parent before you do this. But a lot of times, if I need a really thin line, I'll take a toothpick and kind of make it an even thinner point by using an X-Acto knife. You can get a really thin point by kind of shaving the edges off of a toothpick. So yeah, I do that for my really thin lines, and I find it works pretty well. I mean, it's probably not the most like efficient thing because I use a lot of toothpicks on my customizing, but I just find it's what works best. And toothpicks are super cheap too, and you can get a lot of them for super cheap. And also, you're going to be going back and forth with this as well. Sometimes you use a toothpick and then you realize, oh, I should paint this part, or use a paintbrush and then you say, oh, I realize I should use a toothpick for this part, or you have to add some details and then paint more blocks in. I usually end up just going back and forth a lot. And I know it's funny because this is the most complicated part of customizing, but sadly my my camera died in the middle of this, so I didn't get a lot of footage of it, and it's just really difficult to kind of just explain because I mean the other parts I can kind of talk about more, but the painting has kind of just come to me. I've been doing this for I gotta say, well, I mean, I guess it's been 10 years since I did my first custom. But, I would say, you'll learn if you do this for a while. You will get better at it. And also, working with other art, having previous art experience, will help a lot with this too. Don't get frustrated if you're struggling with the painting. Painting is difficult. Painting anything is difficult, especially minifigures, because they're so small and it's hard to get all of the details. But yeah, I mean, my first customs looked really bad. I have videos showcasing them because they looked really bad. So, I mean, just keep working at them and they will get better, and they'll continue to get better. And I mean, I do it for the fun of it anyway. So if you're having fun, I mean, keep making them. And yeah, I think that's the whole process. If you have any more questions, ask them down below. I'm also going to continue my YouTube short series where I showcase a few other tips if you're looking for tips. And I have a couple of tips already if you want to go ahead and watch them. I think that's it. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.